listener production.
Hey, Bension Siebert here with the briefing. As we record this episode, Israeli tanks have been reportedly spotted just 200 metres from the edge of Rafah. Palestinian civilians have been ordered to evacuate. As you'll be aware if you're a regular listener to this podcast, Rafah is the southernmost city of Gaza. It's on the border with Egypt. And most importantly, it's the last refuge for some 1.4 million Palestinians who've fled the violence and destruction elsewhere in Gaza. Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu argues Israel must invade Rafah in order to destroy Hamas and get Israeli hostages back. Australia, the US, Europe and the United Nations have been saying a ground invasion of Rafah would cause an unimaginable humanitarian catastrophe there, well beyond what we've already seen with some 34,000 Palestinians killed since Israel launched its retaliation for October 7 last year, the day Hamas militants killed around 1,200 Israelis and took about 252 Israelis hostage. Antony Loewenstein is an independent journalist, filmmaker and author of the best-selling book The Palestine Laboratory. He lived in East Jerusalem between 2016 and 2020 and he joins us now. Antony, Australia, the US and various other countries have been urging Israel not to invade Rafah for months now. Why is Israel doing it anyway?
There's a word in your question which really goes to the heart of the problem, urging. Australia, the US, the EU, many Arab states for months have been encouraging Israel not to go into Rafah. They're talking about the insane humanitarian crisis. Biden has talked about Rafah being a red line. And yet there's no consequences when Israel does something in Gaza or the West Bank. This has been the problem for years. There's a culture of rampant impunity.
What do you think it will mean for the people who are trying to survive there in Rafah?
It'll be devastating. I have friends and colleagues, journalist colleagues, and just friends in Gaza who some are still there in the last month, some have got out to Egypt and beyond. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is beyond words. I think there is still, in the wider community, still a real block with accepting this is deliberate starvation by a Western ally, Israel, against the people of Gaza. Deliberate starvation. It's not only my words or my opinion. It's said by literally every single human rights organisation that's on the ground in Gaza. Netanyahu's aim is to never end the war. It's a classic forever war scenario. You never end the war. You constantly tell the Israeli people, many of whom don't accept him anymore as prime minister, but you keep telling them the only solution is military force. And that's brought Israel into a real catastrophic bind because at the end of this campaign, in a week, in a month, 6 months, whenever, Israelis will be less safe in no conceivable way, right? The idea that at the end of this, when Gaza is destroyed, millions of people are displaced and homeless, that will make Israel safer is delusional. And the West, including Australia, needs to call Israel out, but with much more than just words now.
You mentioned that Israel has not achieved its stated aims in Gaza. The Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that there is no way to achieve the destruction of Hamas or the return of all the hostages without going into Rafah. A lot of Israelis, certainly since October 7, will consider Hamas to be an existential threat to the state of Israel. Is Netanyahu wrong about that?
He's wrong for a few reasons. Hamas is not an existential threat to Israel. This doesn't excuse, deny what I've said since October 7, which is what happened on that day I thought was an abomination and outrageous and a crime. But Hamas doesn't existentially threaten Israel. It just doesn't, militarily or any kind of other way. What does threaten Israel existentially, I would argue, and I've been saying this for months and maybe years, Israeli actions in the West Bank and Gaza. An endless occupation means that you have no global legitimacy. This is what threatens Israel. And when Israel has killed 35, 40, 45,000 Palestinians in the last 6 months, the majority of whom are civilians, how in any way does that grant you legitimacy? And the idea somehow that, and many military experts that I've spoken to, and even saying in the Israeli press in the last month or so, Rafah is a PR job. In other words, the idea that somehow going into Rafah to, yes, attempt to defang Hamas or try to capture some of their leaders, some of whom I suspect are not in Rafah anymore anyway, but maybe some are, destroy the tunnels that exist under Gaza. This idea somehow that by doing so, you clearly endanger the hostages. I mean, that's just an obvious thing to say. The hostages, the ones who are alive, we don't even know how many are still alive. 30, 40, 50? No, I don't know, and I'm not sure even Israel arguably knows how many are still alive. That's why within Israel, that 6 months have mostly supported the continuation of the war. There's more and more appetite to end the war, to strike a deal, to get the hostages back. And sadly, Israel's political agenda, not just Netanyahu, but that government, is endless war in this age-old tradition that somehow if you support and continue war, you will get public backing. And increasing that doesn't look like that's happening.
But if you want to destroy Hamas,
which you can't.
You can't destroy Hamas is the argument. But if
you cannot destroy Hamas.
Let's say that Benjamin Netanyahu says that you can and he wants to, then don't you have to go into Rafah, or is that wrong?
It's wrong because Hamas is not just in Rafah. One of the things we've seen in the last few months, as the US found in Iraq and Afghanistan, that Israel has not learned any lessons from what occupation means. That you can go into a territory, use shock and awe tactics, massive military force, and at least initially maybe you can overwhelm your opponent, your enemy. But what's happened in parts of Gaza when those Israeli troops have either pulled out or moved, Hamas reappears. Not all, but many. In other words, what the US found in Iraq or Afghanistan, or frankly Vietnam, was that unless you have millions and millions and millions of troops which nobody has to sort of hold your ground, so to speak, and even that's, of course, illegitimate and illegal and brutal, your enemy, so to speak, will keep resurfacing, let alone the fact that many of the people of Gaza, some of whom hate Hamas and Israel, don't get me wrong, but in the West Bank, for example, where there's a military occupation going on, but it's not a different kind of war, there's a lot of support for Hamas. Across the Arab Muslim world, there's been a great deal of support for Hamas. Rightly or wrongly, that is the reality. And to destroy Hamas means to do what exactly? If you literally destroy any kind of infrastructure in Gaza, which is what's happened, schools, mosques, hospitals, killing 40,000, maybe more civilians, many of whom women and children, how are you destroying Hamas? In fact, you're giving legitimacy to resistance, because at the end of this conflict, whenever that happens, large numbers of Palestinians correctly will want revenge. Why would they not? I'm not saying all, but many. If your parents are being killed, Gaza is facing a long-term tent city reality because the infrastructure is gone, and that will only lead to bad things.
What do you think it would take for a ceasefire to be approved by both sides sustainably?
There's massive pressure on Hamas for some kind of deal, and that's coming from Qatar, who are to some extent housing many Hamas leaders. Many in the Arab world, I'm talking about the Arab elites, are putting pressure on Hamas to end this war because they know it's causing troubles in their own country. On Israel's side, it would take outside pressure, namely the US, to acknowledge and accept that Israel's war aims are unachievable. And as someone who is Jewish myself, although I live obviously in Australia, I say, and I've said as growing numbers of Jews do, that Israeli actions are endangering all of us and in fact worsening anti-Semitism against us, because too many people see Israeli actions synonymous with Jews. And unless there are Jewish people speaking out, as growing numbers of Jews do, that this is not happening in our name, it is not. And a permanent ceasefire, I see the only way that would ever happen, this has to happen across all of Palestine, not just Gaza, is massive outside pressure. And that has to come from Western countries that support Israel and nations that potentially support Hamas, or at least movements that support Hamas.
And massive outside pressure, you've said that urging doesn't quite work. What does that mean in practice?
What that means in practice is arms embargoes, sanctions, boycotts, that Israel and Israelis need to feel economic pain. And I say that because many Israelis and Palestinians that I speak to, and I've spoken to for years, say that because there's a culture of impunity, unless Israelis feel like there's a price to be paid for endless war, let's be clear, the most powerful actor here are not Palestinians, they're Israelis. I just note the last 24 hours, Belgium, a Western country, is trying to rally other European states to potentially impose sanctions on Israel. Now, Belgium is not a massive global power, but the idea that you might have Western allies of Australia potentially cutting trade ties with Israel is a serious possible development. That's a model that Australia could, and I would argue should, apply.
Finally, let's talk about Al Jazeera, a news organisation that you have worked for in the past. The government of Israel banned Al Jazeera. What was your reaction to that, and what do you think that says about what Israel is today?
This was a long time coming. Al Jazeera, running out of Qatar, is hated by Israel because in much of the Arab Muslim world, it is giving voice not just to Palestinians, but also actually, and this is what Al Jazeera says, I'm not speaking obviously as a spokesperson for Al Jazeera at all, that they often give airtime to Israeli officials. They're not ignoring Israel, but Israel hates the fact that if you tell them to Al Jazeera, English or Arabic, you are seeing what's happening in Gaza. You are seeing what's happening in the West Bank. That is the threat that Israel feels that it faces. The idea that Al Jazeera is some national security threat to Israel, which is why they have closed it down, is absurd. Al Jazeera is a legitimate news outlet, and what it says about Israel is that it is a growing sign of intolerance towards critical voices. It will not be the last media outlet that Israel tries to shut down. And it's worth saying that if you're a democracy, you don't shut down media outlets that you don't like. And it's pretty remarkable that Israel's biggest supporters in the West have been remarkably silent in the last 24 hours since Israel has literally stormed into Al Jazeera offices in Jerusalem, weirdly enough, literally opposite to where I used to live in East Jerusalem years ago, and confiscated cameras. Netanyahu was looking for a way to try to, I would argue, ruin the negotiations between Hamas and Israel. Qatar is the funder of Al Jazeera. Qatar is a key backer of Hamas, or at least a supporter. And this was a way to try to give the middle finger to Qatar, essentially.
Antony Loewenstein, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thanks so much for having me.
Antony Loewenstein there. That's it for The Briefing today. Check your feed again from 6 tomorrow morning for the next episode. In the meantime, if you found this episode useful or you like what we do here at The Briefing in general, please tell a friend about the pod. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.